What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. I am back. I got in about, 16 hours ago from France. It was a 19-hour day from the time I got to the airport to the time I pulled into my driveway. Long day traveling home, but what an absolutely amazing adventure it has been. I'm so excited to be bringing you the full videos. I've been uploading the short clips, showing you little bits and pieces. I'm actually going to continue to do that in the midst of our reaction videos and the original content, the full-length videos from these places. We're going to start with the SOMME this Wednesday. The very first episode from my trip to France will be on the PALS battalions, specifically the story of the Accrington PALS and their attack from the site where it happened. Every Wednesday and Sunday after that, I'll be uploading those videos, those full-length videos. Most of them will be 15 to 20 minutes long from the battlefields of France. Excited to bring all of that with you. And since the videos are really snapshots of larger things that are happening, as I get into each of the little mini series of videos, so for example, the first set's going to be from the SOMME, then we're going to do Verdun. I want to do a video like this to kind of talk about the big picture of what was happening at that place, so you can see how the stories that I share fit into that. So we're going to take a look at Epic History TV's video on the Battle of the Somme, and I'll share some tidbits and some more additional information here as I was just walking the battlefields of the Somme. And as is always the case, when you visit a place and you see it in person, it changes your perspective. My perspective of the Somme battlefield has dramatically changed now that I've been there. The scale of the tragedy is much clearer in my mind. So I'm going to talk about that as we go along. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. And if you want to be a part of supporting future trips like the one I just took to France, please consider joining on Patreon or as a member here on YouTube. Thank you in advance. Here we go. Now, it's important to note right off the bat that the Battle of the Somme, when people talk about the Somme, they typically do talk about the 1st of July because that was the big, huge attack along the entire front of the 4th Army of the British, 100 and some thousand British soldiers, a number of French soldiers as well. But the Battle of the Somme actually goes into November. There's another significant attack that happens in November. When you go to the cemeteries, you'll most often see mid-November and July 1st as the main dates for a lot of the deaths.
1916. Europe is in the grips of the most destructive conflict yet known, World War I. Much of the fiercest fighting takes place on the Western Front, where British, French and German armies are locked in a bloody stalemate along 450 miles of trenches. There have been millions of casualties, but neither side can break the deadlock. The combination of barbed wire, machine guns and heavy artillery means troops trying to cross no man's land, the open ground between the trenches, are slaughtered en masse. The advantage is always with the defender.
And we've talked about this before, but I'll say it again. It's an amazing thing to have a war in which all the factors favor defense, but generals who all believe that everything favors the attacker. And that's part of why you get the slaughter on the scale that you do. Until you get into 1916 and they start to finally figure it out, and you have guys like Pétain on the French side who start to advocate for defense. That's the time when they start to shift gears. But at this point, the call to the offensive is still the way it goes. The idea is still that attacking is always better, but everything favors the defense. It's a horrible concoction that results in these millions of casualties.
But the Allies are committed to more attacks. They're determined to liberate the parts of France and Belgium that were occupied by Germany in the first months of the war. The British and French have agreed to launch a joint offensive in the summer of 1916. But the Germans strike first.
So right there you can see there's King George V right there in the center. I'm not entirely sure who the other guys are. That might be Foch there. And that's probably the British High Command right there. I don't know at this point if it would have been French or Haig. Haig replaces French, I think, at the end of 1915. One of the things that happens is that you have a big turnover in the High Command. Pretty much every major nation replaces their commander, their lead commander at some point. The British did. They not only replaced their High Command, their leading general, they go from French to Haig. They end up with a new war minister because their war minister is killed a few months before the Battle of the Somme. They end up with a new prime minister. Same thing with the Germans. They go from von Moltke in the first couple months of the war to then von Falkenhayn, and then in the aftermath of the Somme, they end up with Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And so a lot of turnover. Somebody's got to, heads have to roll because of the massive casualties and the lack of movement one way or the other.
In February, they launch a massive assault on the French fortress city of Verdun.
And here's why this matters, because right here, I think it's right around the city of Méricourt, because I actually saw there's a monument there with a British flag and a French flag. And you'll see it in an upcoming video. They actually have a monument that marks the spot where the British and French lines come together. And that's why they chose the Somme. The Somme was actually a really bad place to attack because it was one of the strongest positions on the entire German front. They chose it because that's where the armies came together, and they wanted it to be there. And it was supposed to be a joint British and French offensive. But then Verdun happens. And the French are having to, they basically rotate their entire army through Verdun. When you go to Verdun and you see the monument, you see the list of all the regiments who fought there. It just goes on forever because basically anybody who was in the French army spent time at Verdun. And so now it becomes a thing where you have mostly a British attack at the Somme and only like 10 or 11 French divisions. And so that's the first problem. And at that point, they probably should have reconsidered, because if it was going to be mostly a British attack, it would have been better to come somewhere else. But they spent months planning this, and so they weren't going to kind of go back on it now.
Its defense requires all available French reserves. So the summer offensive will be led by the British, their biggest attack of the war so far. Its chief aim now, to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun.
And the same thing's happening in the east, on the Eastern Front. I think you have the Brusilov offensive at this time, and all of it's meant to do the same thing. It's meant to put pressure on the Germans at the same time in all places, so they can't use their really good train and interior lines that they have in their train network to kind of bounce troops from one place to another. Same thing that Grant did in 1864 in the American Civil War. Pressure. When you have an opponent that has less resources, less manpower, less of everything than you do, but they're a superior fighting force, you have to pressure them everywhere at once so they can't bounce around like that.
The attack will take place along a 25-mile front near the River Somme in July. The new British commander, General Sir Douglas Haig, would prefer to attack near Ypres, where there are clearer strategic objectives.
Clear strategic objectives. It's a place that they've been fighting already, so they kind of know the ground better. You've got the Belgians up there to help. It's a place where if you can turn the flank, it's one of the things you don't have in this war that you typically have in war are flanks and maneuvering and all that stuff. That's not how this is. This isn't about outmaneuvering the enemy. This isn't about beating him on the battlefield with your tactics. This is about punching a hole somewhere in the line and then breaking through that hole.
But the Somme is where the British and French armies meet, so where a joint offensive must take place. He would also prefer to wait until his inexperienced divisions have received more training.
So it's kind of an interesting irony here. What you have are these PALS battalions, and we're going to talk about that in the video coming out Wednesday. This is really Britain's first real adventure with a lot of volunteer troops, like in massive numbers. The British had a very small but professional army. It had always been that way. Men who made the army their career. This is the first time you really call for volunteers, people to leave other walks of life to temporarily serve in the army until the war's over. And so a lot of these men they're not professional soldiers. And so they're training, they're up to speed. And one of the guys who was most responsible for the existence of the POWs battalions is General Sir Henry Rawlins, who is going to be in command of the British Army at the Somme, leading all of these POWs battalions into a slaughter.
But the French need his help now. The Somme has so far been a quiet sector, allowing the Germans to build up strong defensive positions.
So basically, the front lines at the Somme have been static since the fall of 1914. So that means you're attacking a German force that has had a year and a half, almost 2 years, because July, August, September, a year and 10 months to build up this defensive position, and they have built it up. They've got bunkers 40 feet underground that are reinforced, that have electric lighting. I mean, they can live way down there, and no artillery in the world is going to hit those positions. On top of that, the Germans are up on hill. They have higher ground than almost everywhere on the Somme battlefield, and you see that when you go there. The British are almost always looking up at the Germans. And so you're attacking uphill. But it also means that your artillery, a lot of the times, can't get at the German positions. You also can't see past the front line trench. There's multiple lines of trenches connected by these communication trenches. So you've got a front line trench, and then you've got a second trench and a third trench. And really, they're only able to hit the front line trench with their artillery, whereas the Germans can see all of the British defenses going back.
Here, the Germans have two formidable defensive lines, with a third under construction. Each consists of 3 lines of trenches: fire, support, and reserve, connected by communication trenches. They bristle with machine gun positions, and are anchored on fortified villages and strongpoints.
And they've got really good ways for bringing up supplies. They've got barbed wire, really thick amounts of barbed wire in front that is supposed to be softened up by artillery. But the problem is the British use primarily shrapnel artillery rather than high explosive. And so, great, you're launching a bunch of artillery that shoots a bunch of metal in a bunch of different directions, but it doesn't do anything to the barbed wire. And it doesn't do anything to men who are 40 feet underground either.
In front of the trenches, there are thick belts of barbed wire. Below are dugouts, some 10 meters deep, to shelter German troops from artillery fire.
And you have to understand that this is not just one little set of barbed wire that you can go up to, snip, snip, and you're through. This is several feet thick of really, I mean, it's nothing like you can imagine having to try and cross.
Telephone lines buried 6 feet deep allow troops at the front to communicate with artillery batteries during an attack. The German troops that hold the line are well trained, and most are combat veterans. The offensive will be led by the British Fourth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson. With Haig, he draws up the plan of attack. To overcome the Germans' formidable defences, the British will carry out a massive, week-long artillery bombardment with 1,400 guns.
And so what they do is, and I think they stockpiled like 2.5 million shells for this bombardment. They bombard every morning at like 4:30 or 5 in the morning. They start. And they bombard for a couple of hours. And what this is meant to do is, okay, we bombard for a couple of hours first thing in the morning. The Germans are like, okay, they're coming. They don't come. Happens again the next day. Happens again the next day. So you're getting them to let their guard down. All right, here they go. They're bombarding again. And so they don't really know when it's coming. They're also digging these mines all the way along the line, and I'm sure they'll talk about that.
This is expected to destroy German barbed wire, flatten trenches, and kill their occupants.
But what they do, and this happens all throughout the war, is, yeah, you fire your artillery, you try to destroy the barbed wire, but then as soon as night hits, you send out these patrols, and this happened on both sides. This is when they would go out and try to recover the wounded. This is when they go out and repair any damage that's been done to the barbed wire, things like that.
19 mines are also dug under key German strongpoints and filled with explosive.
And these mines are just, I mean, the logistics involved. I did videos about 2 of the mines. The one at Hawthorne Ridge, which is up here by Beaumont Hamel. And then down here further, you have the Locke mine. And these are just massive mines. They're not the biggest of the war, but I think they might be the biggest to that point in the war. And they take months. I think the Locke crater, where those 2 mines were, they started in December digging the mines, and it's July before they set them off. They go 100 feet down into the ground. They did multiple trenches galleries, mines going under the German lines, and the Germans know this is happening, and so they have these counter mine offensive efforts going on, and I'll talk about that in the Locke video about the counter mining operations and how they would have these moments during the day where everybody would stop, and they'd spend a half hour with like these this listening equipment they would put up, and they would try to hear where they were working and how close they were. And at one point, the British find out that the Germans got within 5 feet of breaking through to their mine during the counter mining operations.
Ready to detonate just before the attack begins. To the north, the British Third Army will make a diversionary attack at Gommecourt. The 16 British and French infantry divisions are then expected to take their objectives with minimal opposition.
And so you see, really on the main attack, there's 2 French divisions and 14 British divisions. So again, the whole thing came down to, it was meant to be a joint thing, but it's almost all British, which again begs the question, why go there? But they had planned it for months. They were going to go. And they were supposed to take several trench lines on the first day. It wasn't just like, all right, get that front line trench and we're done. And some of these places, it's really close. Like, you can't even believe how close it is. Where the Accrington Pals attack up here in the area between Beaumont Hamel and Thiepval, it's like 200 or 300 yards. And they don't even make it that far. That's how bad it was. Actually, they were all the way to the north. They were the very northern attack on Serre. I think that's the 31st Division right there.
The attack will begin at 7:30 a.m. in broad daylight, so the artillery can observe its fire. British morale is high, and the men are confident of victory. Many of the units taking part are PALS battalions, the eager recruits of 1914.
So if you haven't followed the other videos where I've talked about this, the PALS battalions are basically guys who enlisted from the same neighborhoods, from the same workplaces. So all the stockbrokers in London enlisted together, and they became the London Stockbrokers Battalion. And all the guys who lived in the neighborhoods of Accrington join up, and they become the Accrington Pals. And you have all the people who were coal miners in the same town joined up. So, which is great because you're fighting with all the people you know, and it worked out really well because they could train at home. It helped with expenses. You could go to training and go home at night until you got shipped overseas. But it comes to be really, really bad when you have these attacks and you have 80% of a battalion get wiped out, and suddenly all the coal miners from your town are dead. That's why it ends up being a really bad thing.
Now about to face combat for the first time. But on the eve of the assault, there are worrying reports that the British bombardment has been only partially successful.
True.
1.6 million shells are fired. But due to inexperienced gun crews, a shortage of heavy guns, and faulty shells, much of the German barbed wire remains intact.
And it's not so much faulty shell. It's a lot of their shells were, like I said earlier, were shrapnel. They weren't designed for barbed wire. You needed high explosives for that. And they were supposed to have a mix of those. And the estimates are anywhere from 1/3 to 1/5 of all the shells that were fired during the war were duds. So that's millions of unexploded shells. And so the mines are supposed to go off at like 7:28. I think the one mine, the Hawthorne Ridge mine, goes off 10 minutes earlier. They wanted to set it off 4 hours earlier, but were overruled from that. The rest of them go off at 7:28, and most of these battalions have actually, there's a creeping barrage to cover, so all the Germans are down in their bunkers. So most of these battalions aren't in the trenches. You imagine in your mind they blow the whistles, they go up over the top and immediately start getting shot. That's not how it happened. They actually crawled up out of the trenches behind the creeping barrage and started crawling up toward kind of a more forward location. Now, some of those forward locations were trenches. Some places, like the sunken lane, they were just kind of behind a ditch. And then when the creeping barrage lifted at 7:30, right after the mines go off, that's when they stand up and start moving. And in a lot of places, they walk. They don't even run.
German defenders, too, are largely unscathed in their deep dugouts. And from captured prisoners and listening in on uncoded telephone calls, the Germans know exactly when and where the British are coming.
Yep. Everything doomed this thing to disaster.
The Allied artillery bombardment reaches its peak at 7 a.m.
And they sometimes refer to this as a hurricane bombardment, which is where you have a very intense, quick bombardment that happens on the strong points that you're about to attack. And so they're firing this hurricane bombardment on these specific locations.
At 7:20, the British detonate an enormous mine under a German strongpoint,
which we have
the
recording
Hawthorne
video
Redoubt. And British troops rush forward to occupy the crater.
But not till 7:30.
At 7:28, further mines are detonated under German strongpoints along the front. At 7:30, the Allied bombardment moves on to the German second line, as British and French infantry begin their advance across no man's land.
So this was all timed. I mean, like I said, they had been planning this a long time. Every battalion had a series of objectives and a time schedule to take those objectives. And part of the problem you have throughout World War I is that everybody seems to forget that adage, no plan survives contact with the enemy. They seem to operate under the assumption that their plans can go on regardless of what the enemy does. It was true with the Schlieffen plan for the Germans. It's true here at the Somme. They've got this schedule, but that assumes that everything goes exactly the way you expect it to, and it doesn't. It takes them far longer to get those frontline trenches, if they get them at all. In some places, they don't. And so by the time they've taken the frontline trenches, the creeping barrage has already stopped on the next one. And so they're already behind, which means they're not going to have the protection from the artillery that they need to continue on.
German troops, meanwhile, race up from their dugouts to set up machine guns. It's an enduring myth that all the British infantry climb out of their trenches and walk steadily towards the German line.
It's a myth with elements of truth. There were certainly places on the British line where that's exactly what happened. It's not what happened everywhere. And they didn't spread out all in one thing. A lot of places they were kind of more in a straight line, more kind of like one guy at a time going up, and then they spread out a little bit. But yeah, there were certainly places on the line where they walked. It didn't happen everywhere.
A few units do, but most send men out into no man's land before the bombardment lifts.
Yep.
So the final dash toward the enemy line is as short as possible.
Yep.
But in the northern sector, whichever tactics are used, the British are easy targets for German machine gunners, especially where they bunch up to get through the few gaps in the barbed wire. The British infantry advance bravely, but are mown down in their hundreds.
The Accrington Pals, which is the video you're going to see Wednesday, it's horrifying to stand where it happened and see how. Same thing in the Newfoundland park where the Newfoundland regiment was. Same thing, July 1st. To see the distance between the British and the German trenches and to see just how little ground they covered, it tells you how intense it was. You know, you're standing where the Accrington Pals began their attack, and you're looking at the German lines and running at a fast speed, you could cross that ground in 20 seconds easily, even with all the equipment. 20 seconds. And they didn't even make it halfway. I mean, literally none of them made it. I mean, a few of them did. But for the most part, these 1,000-man battalions didn't even make it 50 yards in some places. That's how bad this was. You're talking 19,000 dead, which is 1/6 of all the men who participated in that attack. Think of this. And half of them were casualties. On a 25-mile front, half of the men who attacked were casualties that day. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. And most of it was in the span of a half hour to an hour at most.
Some units do break into the German line. Near Thiepval, the 36th Ulster Division captures the Schwaben redoubt. But without support on either flank, it's isolated, and the survivors are forced to retreat that night. On their right, the 32nd Division takes the Leipzig redoubt, while near La Boisselle, the 34th Division captures the Lochnagar mine crater. But these are just small toeholds in the German line.
None of this matters if you don't have success everywhere, because if you have a couple of isolated places, all you've done now is you got like a Battle of the Bulge situation. You've got a situation like where you had some of these. Look at all the times in history where units advanced in one place. The Lost Battalion, same thing. They advance, but nobody around them does, and so they get surrounded. So if everybody doesn't take their objectives, then you taking your objective means very little.
Far short of their objectives. In World War I, one of the greatest challenges faced by commanders is getting accurate information about the course of the battle. Reliable field radios haven't been invented yet. Telephone lines are regularly cut by shell fire. So officers must turn to messengers, flag signals, light signals,
pigeons,
even homing pigeons, none of which is completely reliable.
But the pigeons were pretty effective. I mean, the Lost Battalion famously has Cher Ami, who is their last homing pigeon that gets out with the word that they're being hit by their friendly fire artillery. Cher Ami gets severely wounded, but still makes it, dies the next year, is in the Smithsonian now. And I think that was like 19 miles that Cher Ami had to fly. So they were pretty effective, surprisingly so.
To get around this problem, during an attack, supporting artillery works to a fixed timetable, moving their fire onto the next line of enemy defences at a set time. So when the infantry start their attack, gunners adjust their fire onto the second line of enemy defences.
Which is great if they stay on the timetable, but that doesn't account for resistance being heavier than you expect and slowing you down.
But if the infantry get held up, the supporting fire keeps moving on according to the timetable. The infantry get left behind and are at the mercy of enemy machine guns. Aerial observation by balloons and aircraft can provide valuable information, but rely on good weather and control of the skies. This is why, on the 1st of July, it takes British commanders hours, even days, to find out which attacks have been successful and which have failed.
Yeah, initially there's reports back home, for example, with the PALs, the Accrington PALs and the Sheffield PALs, those guys all the way in the left flank, that they've taken the town of Serre and held it, which was the northernmost objective. So the early reports, the generals think things are going well. It takes a while before they realize it. And these attacks failed miserably within the first half hour to an hour, but they didn't know it for several hours. And there are these incredible pictures that we have of the trenches taken by aerial photography that show you the situation on the ground.
This makes it extremely difficult for them to react to the situation with any speed. Further south, there is much greater success. Despite heavy losses, the 21st and 7th Divisions take Mametz and cut off the heavily defended village of Fricourt, which the Germans abandon overnight.
And yeah, I mean, this is one of the places, and sometimes you can tell how intense the battle was by how many cemeteries and how many graves you see. And when you go there, the cemeteries are everywhere, because the British tended to, their Commonwealth cemeteries, there's 3,000 of them. The Americans on the whole Western Front have 8 cemeteries for World War I. So the British tended to keep theirs small, but keep them close to where the men died. So you can stand, for example, where the Accrington Pals fought, and within 20 seconds you could run to one of any 4 cemeteries that are on that site. You go to Fricourt, and that's where the big German cemetery is. There's a German cemetery in Fricourt with something like 17, almost 18,000 German graves in it, including the original grave of the Red Baron. So you can tell there was a lot of death that happened in that part of the battlefield for the Germans.
On their right, the 18th and 30th Divisions take their objectives, including the village of Montauban, which is secure by 11 a.m. Alongside them, the veteran French 20th Corps also takes its first-day objectives, as well as 2,500 German prisoners.
So you have to think, if you're the British commander of, I think it was the 9th Corps on that side, you probably think things must be going really well with the Battle of the Somme, because everything on your end of the battlefield, on the right flank, has gone well. You've taken your objectives. You've pushed the enemy back. But it's gone horribly wrong on the left flank.
The Germans didn't expect the offensive to extend so far south, and are less well prepared. And, crucially, the Allied bombardment is boosted by French heavy guns, which are much more effective at destroying barbed wire and German strongpoints.
So you see the difference that intelligence made for the Germans in being prepared, but also the difference that proper use of artillery made. And those were the... It's easy to look back in hindsight and think, man, what a disastrous attack at the Somme. What were they thinking? But those two things go differently, you have a different ball game. And so if you're operating from the standpoint of the British, you're assuming these two things have happened, right? You don't realize the Germans know you're coming to that extent, that they know when and where the attack's coming. And you think that the artillery's been effective. And so based on those two faulty assumptions, there's a relatively reasonable assumption of success, because we see that it was successful in places where those things happened.
At 9:30 a.m., French colonial troops lead the attack south of the Somme River.
So colonial troops, you're talking about a lot of units from Africa, for example, because that's where most of the French colonies are. I mean, there's other places too, but a lot of them, French Polynesia, stuff like that. But a lot of these are troops from Morocco or Algeria, places like that.
The French seize all their objectives and take 3,000 more prisoners.
And you actually, this is interesting too. Sorry, I just came back from the World War I battlefields in places like the Somme, so I've got a lot to unload that I've been absorbing lately. We have a ton of diaries of German soldiers and what they wrote. So we know a lot of what they were thinking and feeling at this point. And there aren't many groups of soldiers that a large group of Germans express a lot of anxiety about facing, but the French colonial troops are among them. You can tell from the Germans' writings that they had a lot of respect and a very healthy dose of fear of these French colonial troops.
Despite success in the south, the first day of the Battle of the Somme is a costly failure for the British. German losses for the day are estimated at 12,000 men. The French lose 7,000. But the British suffer a staggering 57,000 casualties, 1/3 of them killed.
There was one place on the line where I read that the Germans lost something like 300 men and inflicted something like 4,000 or 5,000 casualties. 10-1 was not an uncommon thing along the line, especially on the northern end. Most of those German casualties are going to come on the southern end of the battlefield. Very, very few on the northern end, but 80-85% casualties for a number of British battalions on the left side.
The 1st of July, 1916. becomes the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army.
And most of that in an hour or two.
And it's just the first day in a battle that rages for another 4 months, finally ending in November amid freezing rain and mud. By then, the Allies have advanced 10 miles at a cost of 430,000 British casualties, 200,000 French casualties, and 450,000 German.
So you see that long term, they achieved a lot of their goals. Long term, the casualties are fairly even. It's 1 million casualties. A little less than half of them are German. So, that first day, the really lopsided numbers don't hold out for the span of the entire battle. And most of what we're going to cover in the videos that I made have to do with that attack on the first day. We'll talk about some of the other stuff as well. But of all the places I went, Verdun and the Somme were the ones for me that really just hit me. Just the death. The numbers after a while can numb you, which is why I tried so hard in a lot of the cemeteries to tell individual stories to kind of re-ground us on the fact that these were human lives, and a lot of them were teenagers. But when you walk around there and you just see cemetery after cemetery, you see 1,000 graves here and 5,000 here and 10,000 there, and they're everywhere. You start to get a sense of the cost.
It makes the Battle of the Somme one of the bloodiest in history. In British popular memory, the Somme is remembered as an unmitigated disaster and tragedy, evidence of the incompetence of British generals,
it's a common
and the
thing you hear.
pointless sacrifice of the gallant soldiers under their command. But to those who fought it, and those at home, the Battle of the Somme was seen as a success. Casualties were enormous and hard to bear, but across Europe every warring nation was suffering terrible losses, as all commanders struggled to find an answer to trench warfare. And at the Somme, the British had not only helped save their French ally, who went on to defeat the Germans at Verdun, but learned vital lessons about how to fight on the Western Front. Most of all, the Battle of the Somme had been a costly but necessary wearing down of the German army.
And that's the thing, is that if you think about this from the perspective, and this is a horrible way to think about it, but if you think about it from the perspective of basically one-to-one casualties, which wasn't necessarily happening, the Germans tended to inflict more casualties than they suffered, for the most part. Germany's just got less manpower, less resources. And if it's a war of attrition, nobody knew better than the Germans they couldn't win that. And so it's horrible to think of it this way, but you keep hurling men at the Germans long enough, they're going to run out of men. And that's eventually what happened. They ran out of men. They ran out of the ability to continue the war effort because of the casualties they were suffering, but also the resource war that was happening.
An immensely painful but vital step on the long road to victory.
All right, so like I said, I'm excited to share these videos with you. I'm very proud of how they're coming out. I'm still finishing up editing on the first one, but this is a story that needs to be told. Not enough people know about places like the Somme and Verdun and Champagne and the Marne and all of the Belleau Wood, Meuse-Argonne. These are places we need to know about, and I'm doing my best to bring that to you. And I'm going back. There's so many stories yet to be told. Just my few days at places like Verdun and the Somme, I realized I could have spent 2 weeks at each one of those places, and I went to 5 different places in my 7 days. I could have spent 2 weeks at each place and not told all the stories, so I want to go back, and I will. But be watching. Please make sure your notifications are turned on and that you're subscribed so that when that first video and all subsequent videos go live, you'll see them. I'm also going to continue to upload some little clips here and there that'll be part of the larger videos that happen. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Please hit that like button if you would, and we will see you again soon.